The desert wind carried more than dust that morning. It carried the sound of bare feet stumbling across hardpan earth, the whisper of torn cotton against cactus thorns, and something else Samuel Mitchell had never heard before on his isolated ranch, the desperate breathing of children running for their lives. He found them at dawn, 3 Apache girls collapsed against his weathered gate like wildflowers crushed by a storm. The eldest, maybe 16, had wrapped her arms around them. 2 smaller ones even in unconsciousness, her dark hair matted with blood from a gash across her temple. Their traditional dresses, once beautiful with intricate beadwork, hung in tatters. Their feet were cut and swollen from what must have been days of walking across the unforgiving Arizona territory. Sam had lived alone on this ranch for 18 years. 18 years of talking to horses and cattle instead of people. 18 years of watching the sun rise and set over empty land while the town of Copper Ridge whispered behind his back about the man who couldn't give his wife children. The man whose barren seed had driven away the only woman brave enough to marry him. But as he knelt beside these 3 broken girls, something stirred in his chest that had been dead since Martha left the fierce, protective instinct of a father. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Mitchell Ranch sat like a forgotten promise in the high desert, 8 miles from the nearest neighbor and a world away from the growing bustle of Copper Ridge. Adobe walls baked golden by 17 summers held together a modest house, barn, and the dreams Sam had built with his own hands. When he'd first claimed this land in 1866, fresh from the war and full of hope, he'd imagined children's laughter echoing off these walls. He'd imagined teaching sons to rope cattle and daughters to read by lamplight. Instead, the only sounds were the lowing of livestock and the endless whisper of wind through mesquite. The morning mist still clung to the arroyos when Sam stepped onto his porch, coffee cup in hand, following his daily ritual of watching the sun paint the distant mountains. Copper and gold. But today, something was different. His mare, Juniper, stood at the fence with her ears pricked forward, nostrils flaring at a scent Sam couldn't catch. The cattle had bunched together near the water trough, restless and alert. Even the chickens seemed unusually quiet, as if the entire ranch held its breath. That's when he saw them. At first, Sam thought they might be bundles of cloth caught on his gate. Desert travelers sometimes left offerings or messages tied to fence posts. But as he walked closer, adjusting his hat against the strengthening sun, the bundles took shape. Arms, legs, hair black as midnight spilling across the dust. 3 young Apache girls collapsed in exhaustion, their bodies forming a protective triangle even in their unconscious state. Sam had seen Apache people before, of course. Copper Ridge existed on the edge of what had once been their ancestral hunting grounds, and despite the tensions that had raged through the territory for decades, trade and interaction still occurred. But these weren't the confident, dignified Apache traders who occasionally brought silverwork to the general store. These were children, alone and clearly fleeing something terrible. The eldest girl stirred as Sam's shadow fell across her face. Her eyes opened slowly, dark and wary, scanning his weathered features before settling on the rifle he'd unconsciously grabbed from beside his door. She didn't flinch, didn't cry out, but her hand moved protectively over the smaller girls beside her. In broken English mixed with rapid Apache words Sam couldn't understand, she whispered something that sounded like a plea. Sam set his rifle against the gatepost and held up both hands, palms open. He'd learned enough about Apache customs from his occasional interactions to know that sudden movements could be interpreted as threats. Moving slowly, he knelt beside the girls, noting the cuts on their feet, the dried blood on their clothes, the hollow look of children who'd been hungry too long. "Water," he said softly, pointing toward his house. "Food. Safe." The girl's eyes searched his face for deception, for the trap she'd clearly been taught to expect from white men. But something in Sam's expression, perhaps the gentleness that 18 years of loneliness had softened rather than hardened, convinced her to nod. Over the next hour, Sam carried each girl into his house, settling them on the bed Martha had made with her own hands from cotton grown in the valley. He heated water for washing wounds, prepared a simple meal of cornbread and beef broth, and sat quietly while the eldest girl, who he learned was called Maria, slowly told their story in halting English supplemented by gestures and expressions that transcended language. They were the granddaughters of Chief Robert Blackhorse, she explained, her voice barely above a whisper. Their grandfather had been a respected leader who tried to maintain peace between his people and the growing number of white settlers. But 3 months ago he died suddenly, some said from poison, others from heartbreak at watching his people's sacred lands being carved up and sold to mining companies. Without his protection, the girls had become targets. Thomas Hartwell, the banker who'd recently arrived from back east with plans to develop the territory, had claimed the valley where the girls' family had lived for generations. He'd brought court papers, sheriff's deputies, and promises of violence if they didn't leave immediately. But the valley wasn't just their home, it contained the graves of their ancestors, including their grandfather's final resting place. Leaving meant abandoning everything sacred to their people. The night before they'd fled, Maria whispered, white men had come to their camp with torches and guns. In the chaos and smoke, the 3 sisters had escaped, but their parents and elderly grandmother had been taken to where, they didn't know. For 4 days, they'd walked through desert and mountains, following half-remembered stories their grandfather had told about a white man who'd once shown kindness to Apache travelers, a man who lived alone with horses and cattle somewhere past the Red Rocks. Sam listened without interruption, his weathered hands clenched in his lap as the full horror of their situation became clear. These weren't just lost children. They were refugees from a systematic campaign to drive their people from ancestral lands, and somehow, through desperation and hope, they'd found their way to him. As Maria finished speaking, her 2 younger sisters stirred. Rosa, the middle child, had their grandfather's proud bearing despite her obvious exhaustion, while Elena, the youngest, possessed the kind of curiosity that not even trauma had fully dimmed. They huddled close to Maria, speaking in rapid Apache, while stealing glances at Sam with a mixture of fear and tentative trust. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Sam stood slowly, his mind racing through possibilities and dangers. Harboring Apache children could bring serious consequences. The territorial government had made it clear that Indian troubles were to be reported immediately to authorities. But looking at these 3 girls, remembering the stories Maria had told about their grandfather's peaceful efforts and their family's violent displacement, Sam felt something he hadn't experienced in years: certainty. He walked to an old trunk in the corner of his bedroom and pulled out 3 of Martha's dresses, simple cotton garments that might fit the girls with some adjustment. He set them gently on the bed, along with clean undergarments and stockings. Then he pointed to the wash basin and soap, miming the act of cleaning up. "Rest," he told them, his voice gruff with emotion he couldn't quite name. "You're safe here." But even as he said the words, Sam knew they represented a promise that would change everything. In 18 years of isolation, he'd built a life of careful routine and emotional distance. Now in the space of a single morning, 3 Apache children had stumbled into his world carrying stories of injustice that demanded action, not isolation. As the girls began to wash and change clothes, Sam stepped onto his porch and gazed toward Copper Ridge. Somewhere in that growing town, Thomas Hartwell was probably congratulating himself on clearing troublesome Indians from valuable land. Somewhere, Sheriff Coleman was filing reports that painted the displacement as a routine matter of territorial law. And somewhere, the parents and grandmother of these 3 girls might be imprisoned, injured, or worse. For 18 years, Sam had told himself that staying away from town politics and territorial disputes was the wise choice for a man with his reputation. People already whispered about his failed marriage and childless state. Why give them more reasons to gossip or exclude him? But as he listened to the soft voices of the girls behind him, speaking in their native language while helping each other dress in Martha's old clothes, Sam realized that some situations demanded more than wisdom. They demanded courage. The afternoon. Sun was reaching its peak when Sam made his decision. He hitched his strongest horse to the wagon, loaded it with supplies, and told the girls he was riding into town. Maria's eyes immediately filled with alarm in her experience. White men who went to town returned with authorities and violence. But Sam knelt beside her and spoke slowly, carefully. "I'm going to find out what happened to your family," he said, "and I'm going to make sure nobody comes here to hurt you." It was a promise that sounded simple, but carried the weight of everything Sam had learned about right and wrong during 43 years of life in a territory where both concepts were often complicated by politics, prejudice, and profit. As he rode toward Copper Ridge, leaving the 3 girls hidden in his house with instructions to bar the door and hide if anyone approached, Sam felt the strange sensation of a life that had been on hold finally beginning to move forward. The road to town stretched across alkali flats and through stands of juniper, past the ruins of earlier homesteads that hadn't survived Apache raids, drought, or simply the crushing loneliness of desert life. Sam had ridden this path hundreds of times over the years, usually for supplies or the occasional social obligation he couldn't avoid. But today felt different. Today, he carried passengers' stories and children's faces in his memory, and the familiar landscape seemed to pulse with new urgency. Copper Ridge had grown considerably since Sam's early days in the territory. What had started as a rough collection of tents and lean-tos around a trading post had evolved into a proper town with wooden sidewalks, glass windows, and the kind of civic pride that came with territorial ambitions. The Silver Dollar Saloon anchored one end of the main street, while St. Catherine's Mission Church provided moral balance at the other end. Between them, businesses thrived on the careful dance between civilization and frontier necessity. Sam tied his horse outside the general store and stepped onto the wooden sidewalk, immediately aware of the subtle shift in atmosphere his presence created. Conversations paused slightly as he passed. Eyes followed his movement with the mixture of curiosity and pity he'd grown accustomed to over the years. Samuel Mitchell, the childless widower who lived like a hermit on worthless land, an object of sympathy tinged with the kind of suspicion small towns reserve for those who chose isolation. But today, Sam carried himself differently. The knowledge of 3 Apache girls hidden in his house, and the injustice that had driven them there, had straightened his spine and sharpened his focus. He nodded to familiar faces but didn't stop to exchange pleasantries. Instead, he made his way directly to the boarding house where travelers and new arrivals often stayed while establishing themselves in the territory. Mrs. Morrison, who ran the boarding house with the efficiency of a former army wife, looked up from her ledger as Sam entered the common room. Her expression registered surprise. Sam Mitchell rarely ventured into town except for absolute necessities, and he certainly never frequented establishments where conversation and social interaction were unavoidable. "Afternoon, Sam," she said, setting down her pen. "Looking for someone?" "Thomas Hartwell," Sam replied, removing his hat. "I understand he's staying here." Mrs. Morrison's expression shifted slightly, taking on the careful neutrality of someone who'd learned to navigate the political currents of a territorial town. "He is. Been here about 2 weeks now. Conducting business with the county office." She paused, studying Sam's face. "Might I ask what business you have with him?" Sam considered his response carefully. Mrs. Morrison was known for her discretion, but she was also known for her connections throughout the territory. Information shared with her had a way of reaching interested parties, sometimes in helpful ways, sometimes not. "Land matters," Sam said finally. "I've heard he's been acquiring property in the valley, and I want to understand his intentions." It wasn't entirely a lie, though it certainly wasn't the complete truth. But Mrs. Morrison seemed satisfied with the explanation. She directed Sam to the dining room, where Hartwell was likely reviewing documents over his afternoon meal. Thomas Hartwell was exactly what Sam had expected, a man in his 30s with soft hands and expensive clothes, the kind of Easterner who saw the Arizona Territory as an opportunity for profit rather than a place where people built lives and formed communities. He sat alone at a corner table, papers spread around his plate like a businessman's altar. When Sam approached and introduced himself, Hartwell's eyes lit up with the predatory interest of someone always looking for new opportunities. "Samuel Mitchell," Hartwell repeated, gesturing for Sam to sit. "I don't believe we've met, but I've heard your name. You own property out near Red Rock Canyon, don't you?" Sam nodded, settling into the chair across from Hartwell while studying the man's face for any hint of conscience or uncertainty. He found neither. "Interesting timing, Mr. Mitchell," Hartwell continued, shuffling his papers into a neat stack. "I've been reviewing land ownership records throughout this region, and your property is quite strategically located. Have you ever considered selling?" The casual way Hartwell broached the subject, as if Sam's land was just another commodity to be acquired and developed, confirmed much of what Maria had told him about this man's approach to territorial expansion. But Sam kept his expression neutral, playing the role of a potentially interested seller. "Depends on the offer," Sam said, "and the circumstances of other sales in the area. I understand you've been quite active in acquiring property lately." Hartwell's smile took on a sharper edge. "Business has been very good, Mr. Mitchell. The territorial government is extremely supportive of development efforts, especially when they involve clearing up problematic ownership situations." "Problematic how?" "Well," Hartwell said, lowering his voice slightly, "there's been some confusion about Apache claims to certain lands in the valley. Claims that have no legal standing, of course, but which can complicate legitimate development if not handled properly." Sam felt his jaw tighten, but he maintained his interested expression. "And how does one handle such complications properly?" Hartwell's eyes gleamed with the satisfaction of someone who enjoyed explaining his own cleverness. "Coordination with local authorities is essential. Sheriff Coleman has been extremely helpful in clarifying the legal status of various properties and ensuring that illegitimate occupants understand their position. Sometimes clarity requires a certain degree of emphasis." The euphemistic language barely concealed what Sam now understood to be a coordinated campaign of intimidation and violence. Hartwell wasn't just a land speculator, he was the architect of a systematic effort to drive Apache families from their ancestral homes through a combination of legal manipulation and physical threats. "The emphasis you mentioned," Sam said carefully. "I assume it's been effective?" "Quite," Hartwell replied with obvious satisfaction. "Just last week, we resolved a particularly stubborn situation involving an Apache family that had been squatting in some of the most valuable valley land. They'd claimed some sort of ancestral connection, religious significance, the usual nonsense. But Sheriff Coleman helped them understand that territorial law doesn't recognize such primitive notions of property ownership." Sam's hands clenched beneath the table, but his voice remained steady. "What happened to the family?" "Oh, they're being relocated to more appropriate accommodations," Hartwell said with a dismissive wave. "The territorial government has facilities designed specifically for handling displaced Indians, much more suitable than allowing them to interfere with legitimate development." The clinical way Hartwell described what Sam now understood to be the imprisonment of Maria's family made his stomach turn. But he forced himself to nod as if he approved of such efficiency. "And the children?" Sam asked, trying to keep his voice casual. I imagine Indian families often have children. Hartwell's expression darkened slightly. Actually, that's proven to be something of a complication. 3 young girls managed to escape during the relocation process. Sheriff Coleman has been conducting searches, but they seem to have vanished into the desert. Probably dead by now. Children that age don't survive long without food and water. The casual callousness of Hartwell's assumption that the girls had died hit Sam like a physical blow. This man had orchestrated the destruction of a family and felt nothing but mild irritation that 3 children had escaped his net. Sam stood slowly, his chair scraping against the wooden floor. "Well, Mr. Hartwell, you've given me a lot to think about regarding my own property situation. I appreciate your time." Hartwell smiled and extended his hand. "Of course, Mr. Mitchell. And please, don't hesitate to contact me if you decide you'd like to discuss a sale. Men like us need to work together to bring proper civilization to this territory." Sam shook the offered hand, fighting the urge to squeeze until Hartwell's soft bones cracked. Instead, he nodded politely and left the boarding house, his mind racing with plans and possibilities. The conversation had confirmed his worst fears about what the 3 girls had escaped, but it had also provided crucial information. Their family was alive but imprisoned in what Hartwell euphemistically called territorial facilities. Sheriff Coleman was actively searching for the girls, which meant Sam's ranch would eventually be investigated if the search continued. And most importantly, Hartwell and his associates had convinced themselves that the girls were probably dead, which might buy Sam time to figure out how to help them. As he untied his horse and prepared to ride back to the ranch, Sam realized that his 18 years of isolation were definitively over. The 3 Apache girls sleeping in Martha's old dresses in his house weren't just refugees. They were his responsibility now. And helping them would require all the courage, cunning, and determination he'd been storing up during his years of solitude. The sun was beginning to set as Sam rode home, painting the desert in shades of gold and crimson that reminded him of the traditional colors in the girls' torn clothing. Behind him, Copper Ridge settled into evening routines, its citizens unaware that one of their most reclusive neighbors had just declared a private war against injustice. Ahead of him, his ranch waited in the gathering dusk, no longer the empty sanctuary of a childless man, but the hidden refuge where 3 Apache children slept safely for the first time in days. And somewhere between the town and his home, Samuel Mitchell transformed from a man who had spent 18 years avoiding complications into a father determined to protect the children who had stumbled into his care. The battle for their safety, their family, and their right to exist was just beginning. The ride back to the ranch felt longer than usual, each mile weighted with the knowledge Sam now carried. The conversation with Hartwell had stripped away any illusions about what they were dealing with. This wasn't simply a case of territorial expansion or even routine prejudice. It was a calculated campaign of ethnic cleansing, dressed up in legal language and carried out with the blessing of local authorities. As his horse picked its way through the familiar arroyos and across the hardpan flats, Sam's mind worked through the implications. Sheriff Coleman wasn't just following orders, he was an active participant in Hartwell's scheme. The territorial government facilities Hartwell had mentioned weren't temporary housing. They were prisons designed to break Apache resistance through separation from ancestral lands and cultural connections. And the 3 girls sleeping in his house weren't just refugees. They were witnesses to crimes that powerful men wanted buried along with their victims. The ranch buildings appeared as dark silhouettes against the star-filled sky, oil lamps glowing warmly in the windows Sam had left for the girls. As he approached the house, he could see movement behind the curtains, quick shadows that suggested someone was watching for his return. The sight filled him with an unexpected surge of protectiveness. For 18 years, no one had waited for him to come home. Now 3 children who barely knew him were counting on his return for their very survival. Sam dismounted quietly, unsaddled his horse, and approached the front door with careful steps. Before he could knock, the door opened a crack, revealing Maria's dark eyes scanning the darkness behind him. She'd positioned herself so she could see outside while keeping her sisters hidden deeper in the house, a precaution that spoke to training no 14-year-old should need. "It's just me," Sam said softly, removing his hat. "You're safe." Maria opened the door wider, stepping back to let him enter. In the lamplight, Sam could see that the girls had transformed his sparse bachelor quarters into something resembling a home. Rosa had arranged wildflowers in a tin cup on the table, while Elena had carefully folded and stacked the torn clothing they'd arrived in, salvaging beads and ornaments that could be repaired. They'd prepared a simple meal from his supplies, cornbread and beans seasoned with wild herbs. They must have gathered from around the house during his absence. The domestic scene struck Sam with unexpected force. His house had felt empty for so long that he'd forgotten how human presence could change the very air inside a room. But more than that, these girls had transformed his utilitarian space into something warmer simply by caring for it and each other. "You found information about our family," Maria said. It wasn't a question. Somehow she'd read the answer in his expression or posture as he entered. Sam nodded, settling into his chair while the three girls arranged themselves on the small rug in front of the fireplace. Even in Martha's cotton dresses, they maintained the graceful dignity he'd noticed despite their exhaustion and fear. Rosa sat with the perfect posture of someone trained in formal Apache traditions, while Elena curled against her sister's side with the unconscious trust of a child who'd always been protected. "Your parents and grandmother are alive," Sam began, watching relief flood Maria's face. "But they're being held in what the territorial government calls relocation facilities. From what I learned, these aren't temporary holding areas. They're designed to be permanent." Maria translated rapidly for her sisters in Apache, her voice carefully controlled despite the emotion Sam could see in her eyes. Rosa's face hardened with anger, while Elena simply looked confused, as if the concept of imprisoning families was too foreign for her young mind to fully grasp. "The man responsible is named Thomas Hartwell," Sam continued. "He's a land speculator from back east, working with local authorities to acquire Apache lands for development. Sheriff Coleman is helping him, along with others in the territorial government." "Why are you telling us this?" Maria asked suddenly, her voice sharp with suspicion that hadn't been there before. "Why are you helping us?" "White men who help Apache people usually want something in return." The question hit Sam like a slap, not because it was unfair, but because it was entirely justified. In Maria's experience, white men who offered help to Apache people typically had ulterior motives, information, sexual favors, or political advantage. Her suspicion was a survival mechanism learned through generations of betrayal. Sam leaned forward, his weathered hands clasped between his knees, searching for words that could bridge 18 years of isolation and a lifetime of cultural divide. How could he explain that these three girls had awakened something in him that he'd thought was dead? How could he make them understand that their presence had given him a purpose he'd been missing without even realizing it? 18 years ago, Sam said finally, I came home from town to find my wife packing her belongings. We'd been trying to have children for 5 years, and the doctor had finally told us it was impossible, that I was— He paused, the word still difficult after all these years, barren. She said she couldn't live with a man who couldn't give her the family she'd always wanted. Maria's expression softened slightly, though her wariness remained. Rosa and Elena listened to the translation with the serious attention of children who'd been forced to understand adult complexities too early. For 18 years, I've lived alone on this ranch, watching other men's children grow up, listening to the whispers about the man who failed as a husband because he couldn't father a son. I told myself I was content with solitude, that I didn't need family or community. Sam's voice grew stronger as he continued. "But when I found you three at my gate this morning, when I saw how you protected each other, even while unconscious, I realized something I'd been hiding from myself." He stood and walked to the window, gazing out at the star-filled desert that had been his only companion for so many years. "I may not be able to father children, but that doesn't mean I can't be a father. And right now, you three need a father. More than anyone I've ever met." The words hung in the air like a promise and a confession. Sam had never spoken so openly about his failed marriage or his sense of inadequacy as a man. But something about these three Apache girls, with their courage and dignity in the face of unimaginable loss, had stripped away the careful emotional barriers he'd constructed over nearly 2 decades of loneliness. Maria stood slowly, her eyes studying Sam's face with the intensity of someone making a life-or-death decision. In Apache culture, family bonds were sacred, and the concept of adoption into a clan carried profound spiritual significance. But they were also a practical people, and Maria understood that their survival might depend on accepting help from this strange white man who spoke of fatherhood with the desperation of someone who'd lost everything and found it again in the most unexpected place. "If you are truly offering to be our father," Maria said carefully, "then you must understand what that means. We are not just 3 lost children. We are the granddaughters of Chief Robert Blackhorse. Our grandfather's blood runs in our veins, and his responsibilities now belong to us. We cannot simply hide here while our family suffers in prison." The challenge in her voice was unmistakable. Maria wasn't just testing Sam's commitment. She was making it clear that accepting them as daughters meant accepting their entire heritage, including obligations that could put him in direct conflict with territorial authorities. Sam turned from the window, meeting Maria's gaze directly. "Then we'll find a way to free your family, all of them." The simple declaration sent a visible shiver through the room. Rosa straightened with surprise, while Elena's eyes widened with something that might have been hope. Even Maria seemed taken aback by the directness of Sam's commitment. "You don't understand what you're promising," Maria said. "Hartwell has Sheriff Coleman and others working for him. They have guns, badges, and the law on their side. We have nothing. We have right on our side," Sam replied. "And sometimes that's enough, if you're willing to fight for it." Over the next hour, as the oil lamps burned lower and the desert night settled around the ranch, Sam and the 3 girls began planning something that none of them could have imagined that morning. It started as a discussion of immediate safety, how to keep the girls hidden while Sam gathered more information about their family's location and condition. But gradually, it evolved into something more ambitious and dangerous. Maria knew the layout of the old army fort where Apache prisoners were typically held. Rosa had memorized the patrol schedules of territorial guards from watching their grandfather negotiate with officials over the years. Even Elena contributed crucial information about secret paths through the mountains that their grandmother had taught them, routes that Apache people had used for generations to move unseen through the landscape. As they talked, Sam began to see the outlines of a possible rescue plan. It would require careful timing, detailed intelligence about guard routines, and a level of coordination between Apache traditional knowledge and frontier practical skills. Most importantly, it would require trust between people who had every reason to view each other with suspicion. But as the night wore on and the plans took shape, Sam felt something he hadn't experienced since his early days in the territory, the excitement of building something meaningful with people who mattered to him. For the first time in 18 years, he was part of a family, even if it was a family born of desperation and united by a mission that could get them all killed. When they finally settled down to sleep, the girls sharing Sam's bed while he took the house felt different than it ever had before. The silence was no longer empty, but expectant, filled with the breathing of people who had found each other against impossible odds and committed to risking everything for love and justice. The next morning brought new challenges and revelations that would test their fragile bond. Sam woke before dawn to find Maria already awake, sitting by the window and watching the eastern horizon with the intensity of someone expecting trouble. Her instincts proved accurate as the sun crested the distant mountains. A dust cloud appeared on the road from town, moving steadily toward the ranch. "Someone's coming," Maria whispered, waking her sisters with gentle touches. "Multiple riders." Sam moved to the window, his heart sinking as he recognized the lead rider's bearing and the glint of badges in the morning light. Sheriff Coleman, accompanied by what looked like 4 deputies, was approaching at a pace that suggested official business rather than a social call. "Get dressed quickly," Sam told the girls, his mind racing through options. "Hide in the root cellar behind the house. Don't come out until I give the all-clear signal 3 knocks. Pause, 2 knocks. Maria hesitated, her eyes reflecting the fear that had become her constant companion. "What if they arrest you? What if you don't come back?" Sam knelt beside her, placing his hands on her shoulders with the gentle firmness of a father reassuring. "A frightened child. Then you take your sisters and follow the plan we discussed, but I don't think it will come to that. I'm just a lonely rancher who minds his own business. They have no reason to suspect me of anything." It was a lie, and they both knew it. The timing of Sheriff Coleman's visit, just 1 day after Sam's conversation with Hartwell, suggested that someone had connected his inquiries to the missing Apache girls. But voicing that suspicion would only increase the girls' fear without serving any practical purpose. Rosa and Elena dressed quickly in the Apache clothing they'd arrived in, understanding without explanation that Martha's dresses would raise questions about female visitors. They gathered their few possessions and slipped out the back door toward the concealed root cellar Sam had built years earlier to store vegetables through the harsh desert winters. Maria lingered for a moment, studying Sam's face with the intensity of someone memorizing details that might be important later. "If something happens to you," she said quietly, "we will remember that you called us daughters. That will be enough." The simple statement carried a weight that nearly broke Sam's composure. In Apache culture, being remembered was a form of immortality, and Maria was offering him the greatest gift her people could give, the promise that his sacrifice would be honored even if it failed to save them. Sam watched from his window as the girls disappeared into the carefully camouflaged entrance to the root cellar, then turned his attention to preparing for Sheriff Coleman's visit. He threw on his work clothes, messed his hair to suggest he'd just awakened, and began the morning routine of a man who had nothing to hide, feeding chickens, checking water troughs, and generally behaving like the solitary rancher he'd been. For 18 years, Sheriff Coleman and his deputies approached with the casual confidence of men who expected no resistance. Coleman himself was a large man in his 40s, with the kind of aggressive bearing that suggested he enjoyed the intimidation value of his position. His deputies were younger, nervous, and clearly uncomfortable with whatever mission they'd been assigned. "Morning, Mitchell," Coleman called out as he reined in his horse near Sam's front porch. "Mind if we ask you a few questions?" Sam set down the bucket of chicken feed he'd been carrying and walked toward the mounted men with the unhurried pace of someone accustomed to dealing with interruptions. "Sheriff Coleman, what brings you out to my place this early?" "We're looking for some missing Apache children," Coleman said, his eyes scanning the ranch buildings for any sign of recent visitors. 3 girls who escaped during a relocation operation earlier this week. Someone reported seeing Apache people in this area. The lie was smoothly delivered, but obvious to anyone who understood the geography. Sam's ranch was 8 miles from the nearest neighbor and well off any established Apache travel routes. No one could have reported seeing Apache people here without making the specific effort to observe his property. "Apache children?" Sam replied, injecting just the right amount of concern into his voice. "That sounds dangerous. Are they armed?" One of the younger deputies snorted with amusement at the idea of children being considered armed and dangerous, earning a sharp look from Coleman. The sheriff's expression suggested he was struggling to maintain the pretense that this was a routine welfare check rather than a manhunt. "They're not armed," Coleman said carefully, "but they are considered dangerous in the sense that they're carrying important information about Apache resistance activities. The territorial government is very interested in recovering them safely." Sam nodded with the apparent understanding of a citizen who trusted his elected officials. "Well, as you can see, there's nobody here but me and the livestock. You're welcome to look around if you think it would help." The offer was calculated to demonstrate innocence while also establishing that Sam knew his rights as a property owner. Coleman could search the obvious buildings without a warrant, but anything more extensive would require legal justification. He probably couldn't provide. Coleman dismounted and gestured for his deputies to spread out around the ranch. They spent the next hour going through the barn, checking the chicken coop, and examining the corrals with the thoroughness of men who'd been given specific instructions about what to look for. Sam accompanied them, playing the role of a cooperative citizen while mentally cataloging every detail of their search patterns and techniques. The closest they came to discovering the hidden root cellar was when one deputy noticed the vegetable garden behind the house and commented on how well maintained it was for a bachelor's property. Sam explained that gardening helped pass the time during long desert winters, a perfectly reasonable explanation that the deputy accepted without further investigation. Throughout the search, Sam maintained the careful balance of being helpful without appearing overeager, concerned about the missing children without showing suspicious knowledge of their situation. It was a performance that drew on 18 years of practice at being the kind of unremarkable man that people tended to overlook or dismiss. When Coleman finally remounted his horse, his frustration was evident despite his attempts to maintain official composure. "If you see anything suspicious, Mitchell, any sign of Apache presence in the area, you contact me immediately. These children are in serious danger, and harboring them would be considered aiding enemy combatants." The threat was barely concealed, and Sam recognized it as such. Coleman was warning him that helping the girls would be treated as an act of treason rather than humanitarian aid. But he also heard something else in the sheriff's voice, uncertainty, that suggested Coleman wasn't entirely comfortable with his role in Hartwell's campaign. "Of course, Sheriff," Sam replied. "I hope you find them soon. Desert's no place for children to be wandering alone." After the riders disappeared back toward town, Sam waited a full hour before giving the all-clear signal at the root cellar. The girls emerged blinking into the sunlight, their faces tense with the strain of remaining silent and hidden while armed men searched the property they'd begun to think of as sanctuary. "They'll be back," Maria said matter-of-factly. "Maybe not today, but they'll return with more men and search more carefully." Sam nodded, recognizing the truth in her assessment. Coleman's visit had been a warning as much as a search message. That Sam was now under scrutiny and that any suspicious activity would be met with force. "Then we need to move faster than we planned," Sam said. "We can't wait to gather more information about where your family is being held. We need to act while we still have the element of surprise." Rosa spoke rapidly in Apache, her voice urgent and worried. Maria translated. "She says our grandmother always told us that when the spider web is disturbed, the spider comes quickly. We've disturbed their web by surviving and finding shelter. They won't stop searching until they find us or until we find another way to disappear." The metaphor was apt and ominous. Hartwell's network of officials and enforcers had been disrupted by the girls' escape and Sam's involvement. Like a spider, sensing vibrations in its web, the system would respond with increasing aggression until the disturbance was eliminated. "Then we become the spiders," Sam said grimly, "and we build our own web." That afternoon, as the desert heat reached its peak and the ranch settled into the drowsy quiet of midday, Sam and the three girls began planning something that would have seemed impossible just 2 days earlier. They were going to infiltrate a territorial prison, free Apache captives, and escape across hostile territory while pursued by armed officials who had the full backing of the territorial government. It was a plan born of desperation, love, and the kind of righteous anger that could drive ordinary people to extraordinary acts of courage. And as they worked out the details, drawing maps in the dust of Sam's floor and sharing knowledge that bridged two very different cultures, none of them mentioned the obvious truth that their chances of success were minimal and their chances of survival even smaller. Because sometimes, Sam was learning, being a father meant accepting impossible odds for the sake of your children's future. And sometimes being a daughter meant trusting a stranger who'd proven his love through actions, rather than words. The web they were building would be strong enough to catch their enemies, or it would be the last thing they ever built together. Either way, they would build it as a family. The old military fort that housed Apache prisoners sat like a jagged scar against the red rock cliffs, 20 miles south of Copper Ridge, where the railroad line bent toward the territorial capital. Built during the height of the Apache Wars, Fort Mendoza had once been a symbol of federal authority in the lawless frontier. Now it served a different purpose, a place where inconvenient people could be made to disappear while bureaucrats in distant offices filed reports about successful pacification programs. Sam had ridden past the fort many times over the years, usually while driving cattle to market or returning from business in the territorial capital. He'd always viewed it as just another piece of frontier infrastructure, no more significant than a bridge or a water tower. But now, studying it through his spyglass from a concealed position among the boulder fields, he saw it through the eyes of a man planning to breach its walls and steal its prisoners. The fort consisted of a main compound surrounded by adobe, walls 12 feet high, with guard towers at each corner and a single heavily fortified gate facing the dusty road. Inside the walls, Sam could make out barracks buildings, a central administration building, and what appeared to be prisoner housing arranged in long, low structures that seemed designed more for containment than comfort. Beyond the main compound, a secondary fence enclosed areas that looked like work details prisoners engaged in road construction, quarrying stone, and other labor that generated revenue for the territorial government. Maria lay beside him on the sun-baked rocks, her own eyes scanning the fort with the tactical awareness of someone whose grandfather had taught her to read terrain and defensive positions. Over the past 3 days, they'd made careful reconnaissance. Trips to this position, mapping guard routines, counting personnel, and identifying weaknesses in the fort security. The prisoners are moved to work details every morning at sunrise, Maria whispered, her voice barely audible over the desert wind. They return at sunset. During the day, only the old and sick remain in the compound, along with a skeleton guard force. Sam nodded, making mental notes while continuing his surveillance. How many guards total? 12 to 15 during the day, Maria replied. Maybe 20 at night. But most of them are territorial militia, not regular army. They're used to dealing with broken prisoners, not organized resistance. It was a crucial distinction. Professional soldiers would have maintained discipline and followed protocols, even under unexpected circumstances. Militia forces, especially those assigned to what was essentially a prison guard duty, might panic or make tactical errors when confronted with something outside their normal experience. Rosa had positioned herself further down the ridge, watching the road approaches and supply lines that connected the fort to Copper Ridge and the territorial capital. Her sharp eyes had identified the weekly supply wagon schedule, the courier routes used for official communications, and the patrol patterns of mounted guards, who swept the surrounding area for signs of Apache activity. Elena, despite her youth, had proven invaluable at gathering intelligence through channels that adults would never have access to. Her ability to move silently and remain unnoticed had allowed her to get close enough to the fort to overhear conversations between guards, identify which buildings housed which types of prisoners, and even locate the specific barracks where their family was likely being held. The picture that emerged from their combined observations was both encouraging and terrifying. The fort's security was designed to prevent escapes by desperate, poorly organized prisoners, not to repel a coordinated assault by people who understood both Apache guerrilla tactics and frontier survival skills. But any attempt to breach those walls would have to succeed completely and quickly, because failure would mean death or worse for everyone involved. "There," Elena whispered, pointing toward a section of the outer wall where shadows fell differently than they should. "The wall has been repaired there. Grandfather told me that repaired walls are always weaker than original construction." Sam adjusted his spyglass to examine the area Elena had identified. She was right. The adobe bricks in that section had a slightly different color and texture, suggesting emergency repairs rather than original construction. More importantly, the repair work appeared to have been done hastily, without the careful attention to foundation and mortar that characterized the rest of the fort. "What caused the damage?" Sam asked. Maria's expression darkened. "Apache prisoners tried to escape last winter. The army said they used stolen tools to dig under the wall, but Grandfather heard different stories from traders who were there. He said the prisoners had help from outside, Apache warriors who attacked the wall from this side, while the prisoners fought from inside." The failed escape attempt explained both the hasty repair work and the increased security measures Sam had observed. But it also suggested that other Apache people had attempted similar rescue missions, which meant the idea wasn't completely impossible. "What happened to the prisoners who tried to escape?" "They were moved to a different facility," Maria said quietly. "A place where escape is impossible because it's underground. That's why we have to succeed now, before our family is transferred somewhere we can't reach them." The urgency in her voice reflected a reality Sam was beginning to understand. This wouldn't be their only chance to rescue Maria's family, but it might be their best chance. Every day the prisoners remained in territorial custody increased the likelihood that they would be moved to more secure facilities or simply disappeared into the bureaucratic machinery of forced relocation. Over the next several hours, as the sun tracked across the cloudless sky and the desert heat reached levels that made extended observation nearly unbearable, the four conspirators refined their understanding of the fort's operations and vulnerabilities. They identified guard chain schedules, mapped the interior layout based on prisoner movement patterns, and developed contingency plans for various scenarios that might arise during a rescue attempt. But the more they learned about the fort's defenses and procedures, the more Sam realized that their mission would require something beyond careful planning and tactical knowledge. It would require the kind of desperate courage that comes only from absolute commitment to principles that transcend personal safety. That evening, as they made camp in a hidden canyon 5 miles from the fort, Sam gathered the 3 girls around their small fire and spoke words that he'd been rehearsing in his mind throughout the long day of surveillance. "What we're planning to do tomorrow night is going to be the most dangerous thing any of us has ever attempted," he began, his weathered face serious in the flickering firelight. "There's a good chance that some or all of us won't survive. And even if we succeed in freeing your family, we'll be fugitives for the rest of our lives." Rosa translated quietly for Elena, who listened with the solemn attention of a child who understood that adults sometimes face choices that had no good outcomes. Maria simply nodded, her dark eyes reflecting both fear and determination. "I need each of you to understand what you're risking," Sam continued. "Maria, you're old enough to make this choice for yourself, but you're also responsible for your sisters. Rosa, Elena, you're trusting Maria and me to make decisions that could get you killed. I need to know that you're all certain this is what you want to do." The silence that followed was filled with the soft crackling of burning mesquite and the distant howl of coyotes announcing the coming night. Sam studied each girl's face, looking for any sign of doubt or hesitation that might suggest they weren't fully committed to the dangerous path they'd chosen. Maria spoke first, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was saying. "My grandfather taught me that some things are worth dying for. Family is one of those things. Honor is another. If we don't try to save our parents and grandmother, we dishonor their sacrifice and our grandfather's memory." Rosa's response came in rapid Apache. Translated by Maria, she says that our people have been running and hiding for too long. It's time to fight back, even if we're just children. Even if we're outnumbered. Even if we lose. Elena's contribution was simpler, but perhaps more profound. "I want to see Mama again." The directness of the youngest girl's statement cut through all the tactical considerations and moral complexities to the heart of their mission. They were attempting something that defied reason because a 12-year-old girl wanted to hug her mother, and because the adults who claimed to represent civilization had made that simple desire into an act of rebellion. Sam felt something shift inside his chest as he looked at these three Apache children who'd somehow become his daughters in the space of a few days. For 18 years, he'd convinced himself that his inability to father biological children meant he was destined for isolation. But sitting around this desert fire, planning an impossible rescue mission with three girls who'd chosen to trust him with their lives, he understood that fatherhood had nothing to do with biology and everything to do with love, expressed through sacrifice. "Then we go tomorrow night," Sam said simply. "And whatever happens, we go as a family." The next day passed with agonizing slowness. Each hour waited with anticipation and the careful final preparations that could mean the difference between success and catastrophe. They moved their camp closer to the fort, positioning themselves in a ravine that would provide concealment during daylight, while offering multiple escape routes if their plan failed. Sam spent the morning checking and rechecking their limited equipment, his rifle and handgun, a few dozen rounds of ammunition, rope for climbing, dark cloth for camouflage, and basic medical supplies in case someone was wounded during the escape. It wasn't much to pit against a fortified military installation, but Apache warriors had accomplished remarkable things with even less. The girls used the time to prepare themselves mentally and spiritually for what lay ahead. Maria led her sisters in traditional prayers that honored their grandfather's spirit and asked for protection during the dangerous hours to come. They painted their faces with mud and charcoal in patterns that would help them blend with the darkness, while also connecting them to ancestral traditions of warfare and resistance. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, casting long shadows across the desert landscape, Sam felt the familiar pre-combat tension that he remembered from his days as a young soldier during the territorial conflicts. But this was different from anything he'd experienced before, not the abstract patriotic duty of fighting for distant political concepts, but the immediate, personal urgency of protecting people he loved. The fort's evening routine unfolded exactly as their surveillance had predicted. Work details returned from their various projects as the sun touched the mountains. Guards were changed at the towers and gate, and the compound settled into the relative quiet of night operations. Lights appeared in the administration building and guard quarters, while the prisoner barracks remained dark except for the faint glow of oil lamps carried by guards making their rounds. Sam and the girls moved into final position as full darkness settled over the landscape, using cloud cover to mask their approach to the section of wall that Elena had identified as structurally compromised. The night air carried the sounds of the fort's routine operations guards, call-in challenges and responses, horses moving restlessly in the corrals, and the distant murmur of voices from buildings where people tried to find comfort in an uncomfortable place. Maria had painted her face with traditional war patterns that transformed her from a 16-year-old refugee into something that looked ancient and implacable. Rosa moved with the silent grace of someone who'd learned hunting skills from masters of the art, while Elena's small size and natural stealth made her nearly invisible in the darkness. Sam felt oddly calm as they approached the critical moment. All the planning and preparation had led to this, a test of whether love and determination could overcome institutional power and systematic oppression. He'd spent 18 years avoiding exactly this kind of confrontation, choosing isolation over engagement, safety over principle. But these three girls had changed everything, awakening parts of his character that he'd thought were dead. The weakened section of wall stood before them like a challenge and an opportunity. Beyond it lay their objective, the barracks where Maria's family was imprisoned, the guards who stood between them and freedom, and the beginning of a journey that would either end in joyful reunion or tragic failure. Sam placed his hand on Maria's shoulder, feeling the tension in her young muscles and the absolute determination that radiated from her like heat from a forge. Rosa and Elena flanked them, ready to follow their older sister into whatever dangers lay ahead. For a moment, the four of them stood together in the desert darkness, bound by choices that had transformed them from strangers into family, from victims into warriors, from people who accepted injustice into people who fought against it. Then Sam drew his knife and began working at the mortar between the compromised adobe bricks, starting the process that would either free the Black Horse family or destroy everyone who dared to love them enough to try. The wall proved even weaker than Elena's sharp eyes had suggested. The hasty repair work had used inferior mortar that crumbled under pressure, and the adobe bricks themselves had been damaged by the original escape attempt in ways that weren't visible from the outside. Within 20 minutes of careful work, Sam had opened a gap large enough for a person to crawl through. Maria went first, her lithe form disappearing into the compound like smoke absorbed by darkness. She reappeared moments later with hand signals, indicating that the immediate area was clear, no guards visible, no unexpected obstacles between their entry point and the prisoner barracks. Rosa followed, then Elena, with Sam bringing up the rear after carefully repositioning loose bricks to conceal their breach point. Inside the fort walls, the night seemed both more dangerous and more promising. They were committed now, surrounded by enemies, but also closer to their objective than they'd ever been. The prisoner barracks loomed ahead of them, a long, low building with small windows set high in the walls and a single door, guarded by a territorial militiaman who looked both bored and uncomfortable with his assignment. Sam could see why guarding Apache prisoners was considered a necessary but unpleasant duty, something that ambitious young men did only until better opportunities presented themselves. Maria pointed toward the guard and then made a slashing motion across her throat. The gesture was practical rather than bloodthirsty. They couldn't accomplish their mission while the guard remained at his post, and they couldn't risk him raising an alarm. But Sam found himself hesitating, confronted with the reality that their rescue mission would require violence against people who were, in their own minds, simply doing their jobs. The hesitation lasted only a moment. These men had participated in the destruction of an Apache family, the imprisonment of children's parents, and a systematic campaign of ethnic cleansing. Whatever personal qualities they might possess as individuals, their actions had placed them beyond the reach of Sam's conscience. Sam drew his knife and began moving toward the guard with the careful stealth he'd learned during his own military service. The man never saw him coming, never had a chance to cry out or draw his weapon. One moment he was standing at his post, probably thinking about his sweetheart back in whatever eastern town he'd come from. The next moment he was unconscious on the ground, his keys and weapon in Sam's possession. Maria was already at the barracks door, her ear pressed against the wood as she listened for sounds from inside. When Sam joined her with the guard's keys, she nodded towards specific areas of the building and whispered rapid Apache phrases that he couldn't understand but didn't need to. She was communicating with her family through the traditional songs and calls that Apache people used to identify themselves to each other in dangerous situations. The response came immediately: soft Apache words that made Maria's eyes fill with tears of relief and joy. Her parents and grandmother were alive, conscious, and apparently uninjured. But they weren't alone in the barracks, and some of the other prisoners might complicate any escape attempt. Sam unlocked the door carefully, aware that the next few minutes would determine whether their desperate plan succeeded, or whether they all died together in a territorial prison. As the door swung open, revealing the shadowy interior of the barracks and the faces of people who'd been given up for dead, he felt the weight of responsibility for outcomes that would affect not just his newfound family, but dozens of other Apache people whose only crime had been existing in a place that white men wanted to own. The reunion that followed was both heartbreaking and inspiring. Maria's mother gathering her 3 daughters against her chest, while tears streamed down her weathered face. Rosa and Elena clinging to their grandmother, who whispered Apache prayers of gratitude. And Maria's father studying Sam with the careful assessment of a man trying to understand how a white stranger had become his children's protector. But there was no time for extended celebration or explanation. Other prisoners in the barracks, men, women, and children from several Apache families, looked at the breach in their confinement with expressions that ranged from hope to terror. Some begged to be included in any escape attempt, while others warned that mass escapes had been tried before and always ended in massacre. Sam found himself facing a terrible choice that he hadn't anticipated during their planning. They'd prepared to rescue Maria's immediate family, 5 people, who could move quickly and quietly through terrain they knew well. But the barracks held more than 30 Apache prisoners, including elderly people and small children who couldn't possibly keep up with the kind of rapid movement their escape plan required. Maria read the dilemma in his expression and spoke quietly in Apache to her parents and grandmother. The conversation that followed was brief but intense, conducted in whispers that somehow conveyed enormous emotional weight. When it ended, Maria's father approached Sam and spoke carefully in the broken English that served as a common language between their peoples. "My daughter says you have been father to them," he said, his dark eyes studying Sam's face for signs of deception or weakness. "She says you risk everything to bring us together again. This is a great gift, but now you must choose. Save few who can run fast, or try to save many who cannot." The choice was impossible and unavoidable. Leading 30 prisoners out of a fortified compound would require a different kind of operation, something closer to a military assault than a stealth rescue. But leaving behind families with children, elderly people who'd committed no crimes beyond being Apache, felt like a betrayal of everything that had brought Sam to this moment. In the end, it was Elena who made the decision for all of them. Speaking in rapid Apache to her grandfather's brother, an elderly man who seemed to be the senior figure among the prisoners, she conveyed something that made him nod with profound dignity. He spoke briefly to the other prisoners, and Sam watched as they began organizing themselves with the quiet efficiency of people who'd learned to make life or death decisions quickly. "What's happening?" Sam asked Maria. "Elena told them that grandfather's spirit sent you to open the door," Maria replied, her voice filled with wonder at her youngest sister's wisdom. "She said that some doors lead to freedom and others lead to death, but Apache people must always walk through doors when they're opened. Uncle says the old ones and the small children will follow a different path. They'll wait until morning and then walk out the front gate." Sam started to protest, but Maria continued, "They'll tell the guards that the spirits opened their prison to test whether the white men would try to imprison the wind. When the guards find the broken lock and the missing families, they'll think it was Apache magic, not Apache planning." The plan was audacious, built on a combination of Apache spiritual traditions and the white settlers' own superstitions about native peoples. It might work, or it might result in a massacre, but it would give the younger, stronger prisoners a chance to escape while allowing the elderly and children to choose their own fate rather than being abandoned. Within minutes, the barracks had sorted itself into 2 groups. Maria's family, and 6 other prisoners, all adults, capable of the kind of sustained movement their escape would require, prepared to leave immediately through the gap in the wall. The remaining prisoners settled back into their sleeping positions, prepared to play their own dangerous game with their captors' fears and prejudices. As they prepared to leave, Maria's grandmother approached Sam and spoke softly in Apache while pressing something into his hand, a small medicine pouch made from decorated leather. Maria translated. "She says you are true father now, not just protector. She gives you grandfather's medicine bag to carry his strength with you." The gift represented acceptance into an Apache family in ways that transcended culture, race, and the bitter history between their peoples. Sam felt the weight of the medicine bag and the greater weight of responsibility it represented. He was no longer just a childless white rancher helping desperate refugees. He was now a member of the Black Horse family, with all the obligations and privileges that relationship entailed. The escape from the fort itself proved almost anticlimactic after the emotional intensity of the barracks reunion. Sam's careful observation of guard routines had been accurate, and the gap in the wall remained undetected. Within an hour of entering the compound, they were back in the desert darkness with 7 additional people whose freedom had been purchased with courage, planning, and an enormous amount of luck. But as they moved away from Fort Mendoza and toward the hidden canyon where they'd left their supplies, Sam knew that the real challenges were just beginning. They were now a group of 11 people fleeing across hostile territory with the entire weight of territorial authority organized against them. Every mile they traveled would increase the danger, and every decision they made would have consequences that could mean life or death for people who'd chosen to trust in with their futures. The desert stretched ahead of them like a vast test, beautiful and deadly under the star-filled sky. Somewhere behind them, guards would soon discover the empty barracks and the breached wall. Somewhere ahead lay either freedom or capture, either reunion or tragedy. But for now, in this moment, the Black Horse family was together again. And Sam Mitchell had discovered that being a father had nothing to do with biology and everything to do with love expressed through action. The rest would be determined by the desert, the stars, and the choices they made together as they moved toward an uncertain dawn. The pursuit began at dawn, just as Sam had expected it would. From their concealed position in the rocky outcropping, 12 miles northeast of Fort Mendoza, he could see the dust clouds rising behind them, multiple columns of riders spreading out in a search pattern that spoke of military precision and unlimited determination. Sheriff Coleman had apparently called in reinforcements from the territorial capital, because no local posse could have organized this kind of systematic manhunt so quickly. Maria's father, whose name Sam had learned was Joseph Blackhorse, studied the approaching riders through Sam's spyglass with the calm assessment of a man who'd spent decades evading cavalry patrols. His weathered features showed no fear, only the kind of focused concentration that came from understanding exactly how dangerous their situation had become. 24 riders in the main group, Joseph said quietly, his English careful but clear, maybe more following behind. They have Apache scouts with them. I can see the way they read the ground, the way they move their horses. These are not just territorial militia. The presence of Apache scouts working for the territorial government was the worst news Sam could have imagined. Local militiamen might be fooled by false trails or basic evasion tactics, but Apache trackers would see through such deceptions immediately. More troubling still was the implication that some Apache people had been convinced or coerced into hunting their own relatives. How long before they reached this position? Sam asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. 2 hours. Maybe less, Joseph replied. The scouts will find our trail from the fort within the hour. After that, it becomes a race between their horses and our knowledge of the land. Rosa and Elena huddled close to their mother, speaking in rapid Apache while their grandmother prepared traveling bundles with the efficient movements of someone who'd fled from authorities many times before. The other Apache prisoners who'd escaped with them, 2 men, 1 woman, and a teenage boy, made their own preparations, with the quiet urgency of people who understood that the next few hours would determine whether they died free or died in chains. Sam felt the weight of leadership settling on his shoulders like a physical burden. These 10 people had trusted him to guide them to safety, but his experience with desert survival and frontier warfare was nothing compared to the organized manhunt now bearing down on them. Every decision he made from this point forward would have life or death consequences for people who'd already lost everything except hope. "We can't outrun them," Sam said, stating the obvious truth that everyone present already understood. "But we might be able to outlast them if we can reach the sacred canyons." Joseph nodded slowly. The sacred canyons were a network of hidden gorges and natural fortifications deep in the most remote part of Apache territory, places where the ancestors had hidden during times of war and persecution. They were also nearly 40 miles away, across some of the most difficult terrain in the Arizona Territory, terrain that would test the limits of human endurance even without armed pursuers. "The children," Maria's mother said softly, speaking her first English words since the reunion. "Elena is strong, but she is still 12 years old. Rosa has never walked so far without rest." It was a gentle way of stating another obvious truth there. Group included people who simply couldn't maintain the pace necessary to reach the sacred canyons before their pursuers caught up. The harsh arithmetic of survival was forcing them toward choices that no parent should have to make. But it was Elena herself who provided the solution, speaking rapidly in Apache to her grandfather's spirit guide, an elderly woman whose wisdom had been sought by Apache leaders for generations before her imprisonment. The conversation that followed was conducted in voices so low that Sam couldn't make out individual words, but he could see the profound respect with which all the adults listened to whatever Elena was saying. "What is she telling them?" Sam asked Maria quietly. "She's remembering something grandfather taught her about the old trails," Maria replied, her voice filled with wonder. "There are paths through the mountains that the cavalry has never found. Routes that the ancestors used when they needed to move many people quickly through dangerous territory. Elena knows how to find them." The 12-year-old girl who'd seemed so fragile during their first meeting had revealed herself to be the keeper of geographical knowledge that could save all their lives. In Apache culture, certain children were chosen to memorize the locations of sacred places and secret routes, ensuring that crucial information survived even if adult leaders were killed or captured. Elena's grandfather had apparently selected her for this responsibility, and now that knowledge would be tested under the most extreme circumstances possible. Over the next hour, as the dust clouds of their pursuers grew steadily closer, the group organized itself for the kind of forced march that would either deliver them to safety or kill them in the attempt. They redistributed supplies to ensure that everyone carried only absolute necessities, cached their ammunition and food in hiding places that might be useful if they were forced to double back, and prepared the kind of emergency signals that would allow them to communicate even if they became separated. Sam found himself working alongside Joseph, Black Horse, with the natural coordination of men who'd both served in military units where survival depended on trusting your fellow soldiers completely. Despite the language barriers and cultural differences that separated them, they understood each other's capabilities and limitations with the intuitive clarity that comes from shared danger. "You have been good father to my daughters," Joseph said as they secured the last of their traveling gear. "Better than many Apache men would have been to children, not their blood." The words carried a weight that transcended simple gratitude. In Apache culture, fathers were evaluated not by their biological relationship to children, but by their willingness to sacrifice for the welfare of the next generation. Joseph was formally acknowledging Sam's place in the family structure, granting him the authority and respect that came with proven commitment to his daughter's welfare. "They saved me as much as I saved them," Sam replied honestly. "I was dying of loneliness without knowing it. They gave me a reason to live." Joseph smiled, the first genuinely happy expression Sam had seen from him since the reunion. "That is what daughters do," he said. "They make men remember why the world is worth protecting." The conversation was interrupted by a sharp whistle from Rosa, who'd been watching their back trail from a concealed position higher up the ridge. The advance scouts were closer than expected, close enough that Sam could make out individual riders through his spyglass. They had perhaps 30 minutes before the pursuit reached their current position. Elena took the lead as they abandoned their temporary refuge and began climbing toward the hidden mountain trails that existed more in ancestral memory than in any physical map. The route she chose seemed impossible, a series of narrow ledges and barely visible game trails that wound through rock formations, so treacherous that one misplaced step could mean a fatal fall. But Elena moved through this vertical maze with the confidence of someone following a path she'd walked in dreams and visions throughout her childhood. Her small size and natural agility made her an ideal guide for terrain that would challenge even experienced mountaineers, while her knowledge of Apache route-finding techniques allowed her to identify handholds and footholds that would have been invisible to anyone unfamiliar with traditional climbing methods. The hours that followed tested everyone's physical and mental limits. They climbed through narrow chimney formations where the slightest sound might betray their position to pursuers below. They traversed exposed cliff faces where the desert wind threatened to tear them loose from precarious grips. They squeezed through crevices so tight that larger members of the group had to exhale completely to fit through openings that seemed designed for people half their size. But Elena's route was proving itself with every mile they gained on their pursuers. The territorial cavalry was equipped for pursuit across open desert, not for the kind of technical climbing that Elena's path required. Their horses couldn't follow where the fugitives were going, and their Apache scouts were limited to tracking methods that worked on conventional terrain. By midday, when the sun had turned the exposed rock faces into furnaces that made every breath feel like inhaling fire, they'd gained enough altitude to look back across the entire pursuit effort spread out below them. From their eagle's perspective, Sam could see the frustration and confusion of men who'd lost the trail they'd been following with such confidence just hours earlier. "They're splitting up," Joseph observed, studying the movement patterns of the various cavalry units. "Some are trying to circle around to cut us off. Others are backtracking to look for alternative routes. They know we're up here somewhere, but they don't know how we got here." It was a temporary advantage at best. The territorial authorities had virtually unlimited resources and plenty of time. If they couldn't follow Elena's route directly, they could simply post guards at every known exit from the mountain region and wait for the fugitives to emerge. The sacred canyons Elena was leading them toward might provide temporary refuge, but they wouldn't be a permanent solution. Maria seemed to read Sam's thoughts as they rested in the shade of an overhanging cliff face. "You're thinking like a white man," she said gently. "You're thinking about how to hide until the danger passes. But Apache people don't hide from problems. We change the nature of the problem itself." "What do you mean?" "The territorial government can chase us forever if we're just fugitives running from justice," Maria explained. "But if we become something else, if we become symbols of resistance that other Apache people rally around, then the government has to deal with us differently." Sam was beginning to understand the larger strategy that was taking shape in Maria's mind. They weren't just trying to escape from territorial authority. They were trying to transform their escape into the beginning of a broader resistance movement that would force the government to reconsider its policies toward Apache people. "Your grandfather planned this," Sam said, suddenly seeing connections he'd missed before. The medicine bag, Elena's knowledge of the secret routes, The timing of your family's capture, none of it was accidental. Joseph nodded slowly. My father knew that his death would create opportunities for those who wanted to destroy our people. But he also knew that sometimes destruction creates the conditions for renewal. He prepared Elena to guide survivors to the sacred places where our people have always gathered in times of great crisis. The revelation reframed everything that had happened since Sam first found the three girls collapsed at his gate. They hadn't just stumbled onto his property by chance. They'd been following a plan conceived by a dying Apache leader who'd understood that the survival of his people would require the kind of dramatic action that could only come from desperate circumstances. Elena's route continued to climb through the afternoon, leading them toward peaks that Sam hadn't even known existed in this part of the territory. The landscape around them became increasingly otherworldly, twisted rock formations carved by wind and water into shapes that seemed more like architecture than geology. Hidden springs that provided sweet water in the middle of apparently barren stone, and cave systems that showed signs of human habitation stretching back centuries. "This is where our people came when the Spanish first arrived," Rosa said during one of their brief rest stops. "And where they came when the Mexicans tried to enslave them. And where they came when the Americans started the wars that drove us from our valleys." Sam was looking at Apache history written in stone and hidden pathways, parallel world that existed alongside the familiar landscape of farms and towns and military posts, but remained invisible to anyone who hadn't been initiated into its secrets. Elena wasn't just guiding them to safety. She was leading them into the heart of Apache cultural memory, the places where her people's identity had been preserved through generations of conflict and persecution. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, Elena finally called a halt at what appeared to be nothing more than another unremarkable cliff face. But when she pressed her hand against specific points on the rock surface, a section of what Sam had taken for solid stone swung inward, revealing the entrance to a cavern system that extended deep into the mountain. "The sacred canyons," Maria whispered, her voice filled with awe despite her exhaustion. "I never thought I would see them." The caverns that Elena led them into were unlike anything Sam had ever imagined. Natural chambers opened into vast underground spaces where generations of Apache people had gathered during times of crisis. The walls were covered with paintings that documented centuries of history, hunting scenes, spiritual visions, maps of territory that no longer appeared on any government survey, and portraits of leaders whose names had been forgotten by the outside world, but preserved in this hidden gallery. But the most remarkable feature of the cavern system wasn't its historical significance, it was the evidence that it was still actively used. Fresh water flowed through channels carved into the stone floors. Food stores were maintained in naturally refrigerated alcoves. Sleeping areas were prepared with woven mats and woolen blankets that showed signs of recent use. "Other people come here," Sam said, stating the obvious. "Apache people who never surrendered," Joseph replied. "Families who chose to live free in the mountains rather than accept reservation life. They've been waiting for this moment for the right time to come together and make the government understand that we will not disappear quietly." Over the next several hours, as the fugitive family settled into the cavern complex and began to recover from their harrowing climb, Sam gradually became aware that they weren't alone. Soft voices echoed from deeper chambers, speaking in Apache dialects he couldn't understand. Footsteps moved through connecting passages with the confident silence of people who knew every inch of the cave system. By evening, when small fires began to appear in the main gathering chamber, Sam found himself face to face with something he'd never believed still existed: functioning Apache resistance community that had maintained its independence through decades of government pressure. Men and women emerged from the shadows carrying traditional weapons alongside captured army rifles. Children who'd been born in these caves stared at the newcomers with curious eyes that had never seen the inside of a government school or a territorial courthouse. An elderly woman who seemed to command universal respect approached Sam with the measured dignity of someone accustomed to making decisions that affected many lives. Her English was limited but precise, suggesting education that had been carefully hidden from government authorities. "You are the white man who brought the Black Horse children home," she said, studying his face with eyes that seemed to see through whatever masks or pretenses he might have maintained. "Joseph tells us you claimed them as daughters, that you risked everything to free their family." "Yes," Sam replied simply, unsure what else to say in the face of such direct questioning. "Apache people do not usually trust white men who make such claims," the woman continued. "Too many have used our children for their own purposes, then abandoned them when it became inconvenient to keep promises." Sam felt the weight of every Apache person in the chamber listening to this conversation, evaluating his character and intentions based on words and behaviors that would determine how he was treated by this hidden community. But he also felt the presence of Maria, Rosa, and Elena beside him, 3 young women who'd chosen to trust him with their lives and their family's future. "I didn't choose to become their father," Sam said carefully. "They chose me. All I did was try to be worthy of their trust." The elderly woman smiled, expression so unexpected that it transformed her entire face from stern authority to warm grandmother. "That is the correct answer," she said. "And it tells us that you understand what it means to be Apache family." The ceremony that followed was unlike anything Sam had ever experienced. Using traditions that predated European contact with North America, the hidden Apache community formally welcomed the Black Horse family back into the embrace of their Xhosa people while simultaneously adopting Sam as a member of the clan. Words were spoken in languages so ancient that even some of the Apache participants needed translation. Songs were sung that called upon spiritual forces Sam didn't understand, but could feel responding to the voices raised in the sacred cavern. When it was over, Sam found himself wearing traditional Apache clothing that had been sized to fit him, carrying weapons that had been blessed by medicine people whose authority transcended any government recognition, and bearing responsibilities to a community that existed outside the normal boundaries of territorial law. "What happens now?" he asked Maria as they sat together beside one of the small fires that provided warmth and light in the vast chamber. "Now we wait for the others to arrive," Maria replied. "Word has been sent through the hidden networks to Apache people on every reservation, in every government facility, in every town where our people work as servants or laborers. They're being told that the sacred canyons are open again, that there's a place where Apache families can live free." Sam was beginning to understand the true scope of what they'd set in motion. Their escape from Fort Mendoza hadn't been just a rescue mission. It had been the signal for a carefully planned exodus that would challenge the fundamental assumptions underlying territorial policy toward native peoples. "The government won't allow it," Sam said. "They'll send the army. They'll use artillery if necessary to blast these caves. They can't afford to let Apache people establish an independent community in the heart of the territory." "Maybe," Maria agreed. "But they'll also have to explain to people back east why they're using military force against families who just want to live in peace on land that was never legally taken from them. And every Apache person who dies in these caves will become a symbol that other tribes can rally around." The strategy was both brilliant and terrifying. Force the territorial government into the kind of violent confrontation that would expose the true nature of its policies while simultaneously creating the conditions for broader native resistance. Success would mean the establishment of an Apache homeland that could serve as a beacon for indigenous people throughout the region. Failure would mean the complete destruction of everyone involved. Over the following weeks, as Apache families began arriving in small groups from across the territory, Sam watched the sacred canyons transform into something unprecedented in the history of native-white relations. It wasn't a traditional reservation where Apache people lived under government supervision, nor was it a militant stronghold preparing for warfare against territorial authorities. Instead, it was becoming a functioning Apache society that operated according to traditional laws and customs while adapting pragmatically to the realities of life in the modern American West. Children who'd been separated from their families in government schools reunited with parents who'd given them up for dead. Elderly people who'd been forced to live in exile from their sacred places finally returned to landscapes that held their deepest spiritual significance. Young Apache men and women who'd been working as laborers in territorial towns discovered that they could maintain their cultural identity while contributing to a community that valued both traditional knowledge and practical skills. Sam found his own role in this emerging society, evolving in ways that challenged everything he'd thought he understood about family, community, and identity. As the adoptive father of the Black Horse daughters, he was automatically granted a position of respect within the Apache social structure. But he was also valued for practical skills that the community needed: his knowledge of territorial politics, his familiarity with white settlers' farming and ranching techniques, and his ability to serve as a cultural translator between Apache traditions and the demands of survival in an increasingly dominated landscape. The three girls who'd collapsed at his gate had grown into young women whose wisdom and courage inspired everyone in the sacred canyons. Maria had become a leader among the Apache youth, helping other teenagers navigate the complex process of reclaiming cultural identities that had been suppressed by government schools and family separations. Rosa had revealed herself to be a natural diplomat, capable of building bridges between Apache clans that had been divided by decades of conflict and displacement. Elena had emerged as something even more remarkable, a visionary whose spiritual insights seemed to guide the community's major decisions with an authority that transcended her age. But it was the relationship between Sam and the girls that provided the most powerful symbol of what the sacred canyons represented. Their adoption story had spread throughout the Apache networks, becoming a testament to the possibility of genuine family bonds that transcended race, culture, and the bitter history of territorial expansion. In a landscape dominated by stories of betrayal and violence between native and white peoples, their family offered proof that love and mutual respect could overcome even the deepest divisions. The confrontation with territorial authorities that everyone expected finally came in late autumn, when the first snow began to appear on the highest peaks surrounding the sacred canyons. Sheriff Coleman arrived with a full company of territorial militia, supported by federal troops that had been dispatched from the territorial capital with orders to arrest the Apache fugitives and disperse their unauthorized gathering. But the government forces discovered something they hadn't anticipated. The Apache community in the sacred canyons wasn't hiding from confrontation, but preparing for negotiation. Led by a council of traditional leaders that included Maria's grandmother and other respected elders, they had prepared a formal proposal that would establish the sacred canyons as a recognized Apache homeland in exchange for peace agreements. That would end the cycle of raids and reprisals that had plagued the territory for decades. The proposal was accompanied by documentation that proved the sacred canyons had never been legally ceded to the territorial government, along with testimonies from prominent white settlers who supported Apache land rights and detailed plans for the kind of economic cooperation that could benefit both native and white communities in the region. Sam found himself serving as one of the primary negotiators, drawing on his knowledge of territorial law and his relationships with white ranchers and businessmen who had come to respect his judgment during his years of solitude. It was ironic that his 18 years of avoiding community involvement had somehow prepared him to play a crucial role in creating an entirely new kind of community. The negotiations lasted through the winter, conducted in an atmosphere of mutual suspicion, but also genuine hope that a peaceful resolution might be possible. The territorial government was under pressure from Washington, to find alternatives to the expensive military campaigns that had characterized previous Apache policy, while the Apache community was willing to make significant compromises in exchange for legal recognition of their right to exist as a people. The agreement that finally emerged in the spring was imperfect but historic. The sacred canyons were granted limited autonomy as an Apache homeland, with the understanding that the community would be responsible for maintaining peace with neighboring white settlements. Trade relationships were established that allowed Apache artisans and farmers to sell their products in territorial markets, while white merchants gained access to traditional Apache knowledge about desert survival and natural resource management. Sam was officially appointed as the territorial liaison to the Apache homeland, a position that recognized his unique status as both a white settler and an Apache family member. It was a role that required him to balance competing interests and navigate complex cultural and political boundaries, but it was also an opportunity to help create the kind of just society that had seemed impossible when he first found 3 Apache girls collapsed at his gate. As the years passed and the Apache homeland established itself as a functioning alternative to the reservation system, Sam often reflected on the chain of events that had transformed him from a lonely bachelor into the father of remarkable daughters, and a leader in one of the most successful examples of peaceful coexistence between native and white peoples in the American West. The girls had grown into women whose accomplishments honored both their Apache heritage and the broader human family they'd helped create. Maria became a teacher who worked with children from both Apache and white families, passing on traditional knowledge while preparing young people for life in an increasingly complex world. Rosa developed into a successful trader who built economic bridges between the Apache homeland and territorial markets, proving that prosperity could be achieved without abandoning cultural values. Elena emerged as a spiritual leader whose visions and insights guided not only the Apache community but also white settlers who came to respect her wisdom about living in harmony with the desert landscape. But perhaps the most important lesson Sam learned from his years with the Blackhorse family was that real fatherhood, had nothing to do with biology and everything to do with the willingness to sacrifice for the welfare of children who trusted you with their futures. The 3 Apache girls who'd stumbled into his life had given him something more valuable than the biological children he'd once mourned. They'd given him the opportunity to earn his place in a family through love, courage, and commitment. Justice. Standing on the porch of the house he'd built in the heart of the sacred canyons, watching his daughters work with their own children to preserve and adapt Apache traditions for a new generation, Sam understood that he'd found something that 18 years of loneliness couldn't have taught him. Family wasn't something you were born into. It was something you created through the choices you made when the people you loved needed you most. The desert wind that had once carried only the sound of his solitude now carried the laughter of grandchildren, the songs of traditional ceremonies, and the voices of a community that had chosen hope over despair, cooperation over conflict, and love over the fear that divided peoples who shared the same beautiful, harsh landscape. In the Bay End, that was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. 20 years had passed since that morning when Sam first found 3 Apache girls collapsed at his gate, and the world had changed in ways that none of them could have imagined. The sacred canyons had evolved from a desperate refuge into a thriving community that served as a model for peaceful coexistence between native and white peoples throughout the American West. What had begun as an emergency escape had transformed into something unprecedented in the history of territorial expansion, a place where 2 cultures had learned to strengthen each other rather than destroy what they couldn't understand. Sam stood on the wooden porch of his adobe house, built in the traditional Apache style, but incorporating innovations that made desert life more comfortable for a man approaching his 70s. The morning sun painted the red rock walls of the canyon in shades of gold and copper, the same colors that had decorated the torn dresses of 3 frightened Children who'd somehow found their way to exactly the right place at exactly the right moment. The silence that had once been his only companion was now filled with the sounds of a community waking up children, calling to each other in both Apache and English. The lowing of cattle in the communal herds, the ring of metal on metal from the blacksmith shop where young Apache men learned to work iron alongside traditional crafts. Maria emerged from the house behind him, her dark hair now streaked with silver, but her eyes still carrying the fierce intelligence that had enabled her to survive the destruction of her original family and help create something entirely new. She moved with the quiet confidence of a woman who'd found her place in the world through struggle and determination, carrying a steaming cup of coffee that had become their shared morning ritual over the decades. The territorial governor's delegation will arrive this afternoon, she said, settling into the chair beside Sam's with the comfortable familiarity of someone who'd shared thousands of such mornings. Rosa thinks they're going to propose expanding the homeland boundaries to include the mineral rights in the eastern valleys. Sam nodded, sipping his coffee while considering the political implications of such a proposal. The success of the Apache homeland had attracted attention from government officials, who were beginning to understand that cooperation might be more profitable than conflict. The discovery of silver deposits in the eastern valleys had complicated the situation, but it had also created opportunities for the kind of economic partnerships that could benefit everyone involved. What does Elena think? Sam asked, because the youngest of his daughters had developed into something remarkable over the years, a spiritual leader whose visions and insights had guided the community through countless challenges, but also a practical negotiator who understood the complexities of dealing with territorial authorities. She says the spirits are pleased with how we've used the land they gave us, Maria replied with a smile. But she also says that expansion brings new responsibilities. More land means more opportunities for conflict with white settlers who don't understand our ways. It was a concern that had grown more pressing as the Apache homeland success had attracted attention from across the territory. White families displaced by drought or economic hardship had begun requesting permission to settle in the canyons, drawn by stories of a place where different peoples lived in harmony. Some Apache community members welcomed these requests as opportunities to build bridges, while others worried about losing the cultural identity that had made their success possible. Elena appeared in the doorway as if summoned by their conversation, her presence as calming and authoritative as it had been when she was 12 years old, guiding them through impossible mountain trails. She'd grown into a woman whose wisdom seemed to transcend her years, someone whose counsel was sought not only by Apache people, but by white settlers, territorial officials, and even representatives of other tribes who'd heard about the sacred canyon's unique approach to cultural preservation. The delegation brings more than proposals about mineral rights, Elena said, settling onto the porch steps with the unconscious grace that had always characterized her movements. They bring questions about whether what we've created here can be replicated in other places with other tribes. Sam felt a familiar stirring of pride and apprehension. The Apache homeland had become a symbol of what was possible when people chose cooperation over conflict, but symbols carried burdens as well as honors. Success brought scrutiny, and scrutiny brought pressures that could threaten the very qualities that had made success possible. Are we ready for that kind of responsibility? Sam asked. We've been preparing for it since the day we arrived, Elena replied. Grandfather's vision wasn't just about saving our family or even our people. It was about creating something that could help heal the wounds between all peoples who share this land. Rosa joined them on the porch, her rival completing the family gathering that had become their tradition whenever important decisions needed to be made. She carried herself with the confidence of someone who'd built successful businesses while maintaining deep cultural roots, her practical intelligence complementing her sister's more spiritual gifts. The white settlers in Copper Ridge are watching this negotiation carefully, Rosa reported. Some are worried that expanding Apache territory will limit their own opportunities for growth. Others see it as a chance to learn from our successes. With desert agriculture and water management, it was a delicate balance that required constant attention. The Apache homeland's innovations in desert farming had produced crop yields that exceeded anything achieved by traditional white settler methods. But sharing that knowledge required trust that had been built slowly over decades of careful relationship building. Sam studied the faces of his 3 daughters, marveling at how the frightened children who'd stumbled into his life had grown into women whose wisdom and courage had transformed not only their own community, but the entire understanding of what was possible between native and white peoples. Maria had become a bridge between cultures, teaching Apache children about the wider world while helping white settlers understand traditional knowledge. Rosa had created economic networks that proved cooperation could be more profitable than exploitation. Elena had emerged as a spiritual leader whose insights transcended cultural boundaries. But more than their individual accomplishments, it was their relationship with each other and with him that had demonstrated the possibility of genuine family bonds that transcended race, culture, and the bitter history of territorial expansion. In a landscape dominated by stories of betrayal and violence, their family had become proof that love and mutual respect could overcome even the deepest divisions. "Whatever we decide about the expansion," Sam said finally, "we need to remember that our strength has always come from putting family first. The homeland works because we treat everyone here like family, with all the responsibilities and privileges that relationship entails." Elena nodded thoughtfully. "The spirits have been showing me visions of Apache communities in other territories. Places where our people could live free while maintaining the kind of relationships with white settlers that we've built here. But each place would need to find its own path, its own way of honoring both traditional knowledge and new realities." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Joseph Blackhorse, now in his 70s, but still carrying himself with the dignity that had impressed Sam from their first meeting. Maria's father had become one of the most respected leaders in the Apache homeland, his combination of traditional wisdom and practical experience providing guidance that helped the community navigate the complex challenges of maintaining cultural identity while adapting to an increasingly modern world. "The scouts report that the territorial delegation is larger than expected," Joseph said, settling into the chair that had been reserved for him. "They're bringing representatives from Washington, along with officials from other territories who want to learn about our success." Sam felt a familiar mixture of pride and concern. The attention was gratifying proof that their experiment in peaceful coexistence had succeeded beyond their wildest dreams. But it also brought pressures that could threaten the very qualities that had made that success possible. "Are we ready to become a model for other communities?" Sam asked. "We've been a model since the day we chose cooperation over conflict," Joseph replied. "The question is whether we're ready to help others find their own paths to the same kind of success." Over the next several hours, as the family prepared for the afternoon's negotiations, Sam found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this moment. The lonely bachelor who'd once talked only to horses and cattle had become the father of remarkable daughters and a leader in one of the most successful examples of peaceful coexistence in the American West. The frightened Apache children who'd collapsed at his gate had grown into women whose wisdom and courage had transformed not only their own lives, but the lives of everyone around them. The sacred canyons had evolved from a desperate refuge into a thriving community that demonstrated the possibility of genuine partnership between different peoples. Traditional Apache knowledge had been combined with white settler innovations to create agricultural techniques that exceeded anything either culture had achieved independently. Apache spiritual traditions had been preserved and honored while adapting to the realities of life in an increasingly complex world. But perhaps most importantly, the community had proved that family bonds could transcend the artificial boundaries that divided peoples who shared the same beautiful, harsh landscape. The adoption of Sam into the Apache family structure had created a bridge between cultures that had seemed irreconcilably different. The success of their mixed community had attracted other families, both Apache and white, who were seeking alternatives to the cycle of conflict and misunderstanding that had characterized most interactions between native and settler peoples. When the territorial delegation arrived that afternoon, they found a community that had transformed the very concept of what was possible in the American West. The officials who'd come expecting to negotiate with a small group of Apache fugitives instead discovered a functioning society that had successfully combined traditional knowledge with modern innovations, creating prosperity that benefited everyone involved. The negotiations that followed were unlike anything Sam had experienced during his years of serving as liaison between the Apache homeland and territorial authorities. Instead of the defensive posturing that had characterized earlier meetings, the discussions focused on how the community's successes could be replicated in other locations, how their innovations in desert agriculture and water management could benefit struggling white settlements, and how their model of cultural cooperation could be adapted to address conflicts between other tribes and settler communities. Elena's spiritual insights proved crucial during the most difficult moments of the negotiations. Her ability to find common ground between different cultural perspectives had helped create solutions that honored both Apache traditions and territorial legal requirements. Her visions of other Apache communities living in harmony with white neighbors had provided a framework for expansion that could benefit everyone involved. Rosa's economic expertise had demonstrated that cooperation could be more profitable than exploitation, that traditional Apache knowledge could enhance rather than threaten white settler prosperity. Her networks of trade relationships had created economic incentives for peace that complemented the legal and cultural agreements that formalized their coexistence. Maria's work as a cultural bridge had shown that children from different backgrounds could learn from each other without losing their distinctive identities. Her schools had produced a generation of young people who were equally comfortable with Apache traditions and white settler customs, creating the foundation for long-term peaceful coexistence. But it was the relationship between Sam and his adopted daughters that provided the most powerful symbol of what the sacred canyons represented. Their family story had become a testament to the possibility of genuine bonds that transcended race, culture, and the bitter history of territorial expansion. In a landscape dominated by stories of betrayal and violence, their love had offered proof that people could choose cooperation over conflict, understanding over fear. As the sun set over the red rock walls of the canyon, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that reminded Sam of the traditional colors in Apache clothing, the negotiations concluded with agreements that would have seemed impossible 20 years earlier. The Apache homeland would be expanded to include the mineral-rich eastern valleys, but the development would be managed jointly by Apache and white communities, with profits shared according to formulas that honored both traditional land rights and territorial legal requirements. More importantly, the federal government had agreed to support the establishment of similar communities in other territories, using the sacred canyons as a model for the kind of peaceful coexistence that could end the cycle of warfare and displacement that had characterized previous Indian policy. Elena would travel to these new locations as a spiritual advisor. Rosa would help establish the economic networks that had made their prosperity possible. And Maria would train the teachers who would help children from different cultures learn to live as neighbors rather than enemies. Sam would continue to serve as the primary liaison between Apache and white communities, drawing on his unique perspective as both a white settler and an Apache family member. His role had evolved from that of a desperate father trying to save his adopted daughters into that of a leader helping to create a new kind of society that honored both traditional knowledge and modern realities. That evening, as the family gathered around their traditional fire to share the meal that had become their daily ritual of gratitude and connection, Sam looked at the faces of his daughters and felt the deep satisfaction of a man who'd found his true purpose in life. The loneliness that had once defined his existence had been replaced by the rich complexity of family, relationships that transcended simple biological connections. Elena spoke the traditional Apache blessing that honored the spirits of their ancestors, while acknowledging the new realities they'd created together. Rosa added words of gratitude for the economic prosperity that had come from choosing cooperation over conflict. Maria offered thanks for the children who were growing up in a world where different cultures could strengthen each other rather than destroy what they couldn't understand. Sam's contribution to the evening blessing was simple but heartfelt. "I'm grateful for the morning when 3 Apache girls collapsed at my gate, because that was the morning I learned that family isn't something you're born into, it's something you create through the choices you make when the people you love need you most." The words carried the weight of 20 years of shared struggles and triumphs, of a love that had grown from desperate circumstances into something that had transformed not only their own lives, but the lives of everyone around them. The sacred canyons had become more than a refuge. They'd become a testament to the possibility of genuine family bonds that could bridge any divide, overcome any obstacle, and create something beautiful from the most unlikely circumstances. As the fire burned down and the stars appeared in the clear desert sky, Sam reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. The infertile cowboy who'd once lived alone with only his regrets for company had become the father of remarkable daughters and a leader in one of the most successful examples of peaceful coexistence in American history. The frightened Apache children who'd stumbled into his life had grown into women whose wisdom and courage had proven that love was stronger than fear, that cooperation was more powerful than conflict, and that family was the foundation upon which all other human achievements were built. The desert wind that had once carried only the sound of his solitude now carried the laughter of grandchildren, the songs of traditional ceremonies, and the voices of a community that had chosen hope over despair. In the end, that was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything a man could ask for from a life well lived, a family well loved, and a legacy that would endure long after the last echoes of their voices had faded into the eternal silence of the sacred canyons. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.